Michelle Sue Tharp. Michelle Sue Tharp lived in Washington County, Pennsylvania, where neighbors thought they knew her story. A struggling mother trying her best. What they didn't know was that behind her front door, 7-year-old Tasha Lee Lanham was disappearing. Not from any medical condition doctors could name. She was disappearing because the woman who should have fed her was choosing not to. In April 1998, when Tasha finally died, she weighed just 11 pounds. 11 pounds. Most newborns weigh more than that. At 7 years old, this little girl measured only 31 inches tall. Her body had consumed itself trying to survive, eating away at muscle and tissue just to keep her heart beating one more day. But even that wasn't enough. Michelle didn't call for help when Tasha stopped breathing. Instead, she did something else. She wrapped her daughter's tiny body and drove to West Virginia, where she dumped her like unwanted garbage along a remote roadside. Then she came home and called police with a different story entirely. She claimed Tasha had been kidnapped from a shopping mall in Ohio. She even went on television, pleading for her daughter's safe return, tears streaming down her face as she begged the kidnapper to bring her baby home. For days, search teams combed through Ohio looking for a little girl who was already dead, thrown away by the mother who was supposed to protect her. Michelle kept up the act, appearing at vigils and speaking to reporters about her hope that Tasha would return. But investigators started noticing things that didn't add up. When they questioned Michelle more closely, her story began falling apart. The truth came out piece by piece. There was no kidnapping. There was no stranger who had stolen Tasha away. There was only a mother who had watched her child starve to death in front of her eyes and done nothing to stop it. Medical examiners found that Tasha had been systematically starved for months, maybe years. Her growth had been stunted, her development halted, her young body slowly consuming itself in a desperate fight for survival. Michelle had other children too. They were taken into protective custody, and what investigators found shocked them. While Tasha had been starving, the other children appeared healthy and well-fed. This wasn't poverty or neglect affecting the whole family. This was targeted starvation of one specific child. Michelle had made a choice about which children deserved to eat and which didn't. At trial, prosecutors painted a picture of a woman who had deliberately and systematically murdered her own daughter through starvation. They argued that Michelle had singled out Tasha for this treatment while caring for her other children normally. The defense tried to argue that Michelle suffered from mental illness and wasn't fully responsible for her actions, but the jury didn't buy it. On November 14, 2000, Michelle Sue Tharp was found guilty of first-degree murder. 3 days later, the same jury handed down her sentence, death. She became one of the few women in Pennsylvania history to receive capital punishment. Michelle's case went through years of appeals, with her attorneys arguing that she deserved a new sentencing hearing due to ineffective counsel. In 2017, a court agreed, finding that her original defense team should have presented more evidence about her mental health. But even with that victory, Michelle remains locked away, waiting to learn if she'll spend the rest of her life in prison or face execution for what she did to Tasha. The little girl who died weighing 11 pounds at 7 years old never got to start school, never learned to read, never had a chance to grow up and become whoever she might have been. Her short life was defined by hunger, by pain, and by the betrayal of the person who was supposed to love her most. Tina Brown. On March 24, 2010, in Pensacola, Florida, Andriano thought she was going to hang out with people she considered friends. Instead, she walked into an ambush that had been planned for days. Tina Brown, her daughter, and a neighbor had been plotting against Andriano, convinced she had stolen money from them. What started as an accusation of theft became something far more sinister. They didn't just confront Andriano and demand the money back. They didn't call police or take her to court. Instead, they decided to become judge, jury, and execution themselves. And what they did to her goes beyond anything most people could imagine inflicting on another human being. First, they attacked her with a stun gun, sending electrical shocks through her body again and again. But that was just the beginning. They gagged her so she couldn't scream for help, then forced her into the trunk of a car. Can you imagine the terror? Being trapped in darkness, unable to speak, knowing that these people who had already hurt you were taking you somewhere even worse? They drove her into the woods, to a place where no one would hear what happened next. There, they pulled her from the trunk and continued their assault. They beat her with a crowbar, metal striking flesh and bone with sickening force. But even that wasn't enough for them. Even after all the pain they had already inflicted, they still weren't finished. They poured gasoline all over Adriana's body while she was still alive, still conscious, still able to feel everything that was happening to her. Then they lit her on fire, 19 years old, and she died burning alive in those woods, her final moments filled with agony that no human being should ever experience. But the story doesn't end there. After murdering Adriana in the most horrific way possible, Tina Brown went home and tried to act like nothing had happened. She didn't turn herself in. She didn't confess to anyone. She simply went about her daily routine as if she hadn't just participated in torture and murder. When police finally connected her to Adriana's death, Tina tried to minimize her role. She claimed the others were more responsible, that she had been reluctant to participate. But the evidence painted a different picture. Phone records, witness statements, and physical evidence all pointed to Tina as one of the main orchestrators of the attack. The trial revealed the full scope of what had been done to Adriana. Medical examiners testified about the multiple injuries she had suffered, the burns that covered her body, the way she had died in unimaginable pain. The jury heard about how the attackers had planned the assault, how they had acquired the materials they would use, how they had chosen a location where they would carry out their plan. On June 21st, 2012, after deliberating for just 1 hour, the jury found Tina Brown guilty of first-degree murder. 5 days later, the same jury recommended that she receive the death penalty. They had heard enough about what happened to Adriana to know that this crime deserved the most severe punishment available under law. Tina was 41 years old when she was sentenced to die for her role in Adriana's murder. She joined the small group of women on Florida's death row, where she remains today. Her appeals have been repeatedly denied, with courts finding that her conviction and sentence were appropriate given the nature of her crime. Now 54 years old, Tina Brown sits in her cell, knowing that someday the state of Florida may carry out her execution. She's currently the only woman on Florida's death row, after other female inmates have had their sentences commuted or overturned. But her case remains solid, her conviction secure, her sentence intact. Adriana Zimmerman never got to turn 20. She never got to finish college, start a career, fall in love, or have children of her own. Her life was cut short in the most horrible way imaginable by people she had trusted. People who decided that their suspicions justified torture and murder. Wendi Andriano. When Joe Andriano was diagnosed with cancer at just 33 years old, his wife Wendi promised to stand by him through sickness and health. She would care for him as his condition worsened, help him through chemotherapy, and be there for him during the most difficult time of his life. But as Joe grew sicker and weaker, Wendi was making different plans entirely. October 8th, 2000, started like any other day in their Ahwatukee apartment. Joe was struggling with his cancer treatment, his body ravaged by the disease and the harsh medications meant to fight it. He trusted his wife completely, depending on her for everything as his health declined. What he didn't know was that Wendi had grown tired of being a caregiver. She had grown tired of him. Instead of helping her dying husband, Wendi had decided to speed up the process. She had already tried poisoning him with antifreeze mixed into his drinks, but that wasn't working fast enough for her liking. So on that October evening, she chose a more direct approach. While Joe lay weakened and vulnerable, fighting a battle against cancer that was already killing him, Wendi picked up a bar stool and began beating him with it. Joe, already weakened by months of cancer treatment, couldn't defend himself against his wife's assault. She struck him repeatedly with the bar stool, metal and would connect it with his body, as he tried to understand why the person who had promised to love him was now trying to kill him. But Wendi wasn't finished. Even after bludgeoning him with the bar stool, she wanted to make sure he was dead. She grabbed a 13-inch knife in the kitchen and plunged it deep into Joe's neck, severing arteries and ensuring that he would bleed to death even if the beating hadn't killed him. Her husband, the man she had married and promised to cherish, died on their apartment floor while she stood over him covered in his blood. But Wendi's plan went beyond just killing Joe. She needed to make it look like someone else had done it, like she was a victim too. So she took that same 13-inch knife and inflicted wounds on herself, creating injuries that would support her story about an intruder who had broken in and attacked them both. She called 911 hysterical, claiming that someone had broken into their apartment and killed her husband while trying to kill her too. When paramedics and police arrived, they found Joe dead on the floor and Wendi wounded but alive, telling a story about a mysterious attacker who had fled the scene. At first, investigators believed her. Why would they suspect a grieving wife, wounded herself, of murdering her terminally ill husband? But as they dug deeper into the case, inconsistencies in Wendi's story began to emerge. The crime scene didn't match her version of events. The wound she had inflicted on herself appeared to be self-inflicted rather than defensive injuries from fighting an attacker. Neighbors hadn't seen anyone fleeing the apartment building, and when investigators looked into the couple's finances, they discovered that Wendi stood to collect significant life insurance money from Joe's death. The truth slowly came out during the investigation. Joe had been growing suspicious of his wife's behavior in the weeks before his murder. He had confided to friends that he thought she might be trying to poison him, that he was getting sicker than his cancer treatment should have made him. He had even started hiding his medications and refusing drinks that Wendi prepared for him. Medical tests confirmed Joe's suspicions posthumously. His body contained high levels of antifreeze, proving that Wendi had indeed been trying to poison him before she decided to kill him more directly. The attempted poisoning showed premeditation, proving that this wasn't a crime of passion, but a calculated plan to murder her husband. At trial, prosecutors presented evidence of Wendi's planning and execution of Joe's murder. They showed that she had tried multiple methods to kill him, from poison to physical assault, and that she had tried to cover up her crimes by making it look like a home invasion. The jury heard testimony about Joe's declining health, his suspicions about his wife, and his tragic final moments as the person he trusted most took his life. On November 18, 2004, when Elizabeth Andriano was found guilty of first-degree murder. A month later, she was sentenced to death for killing her terminally ill husband. She was 34 years old when she received her death sentence, and she has been fighting it in court ever since. Today, Wendi remains on death row at the Perryville Women's Prison in Arizona. Her appeals have been repeatedly denied, with courts finding that her conviction was solid and her sentence appropriate. She spent more than 20 years in prison for a crime that shocked even experienced investigators with its coldness and calculation. Joe Andriano died twice, in a sense. First, he was dying slowly from cancer, a disease that was stealing his life bit by bit. But before that natural process could run its course, his wife decided to murder him in their home, taking away even the dignity of dying for his illness, surrounded by people who loved him. Margaret Allen. Margaret lived alone in Brevard County, Florida, where she had developed a reputation for being difficult and suspicious of others. When she hired Wendi as her housekeeper, it seemed like a practical arrangement. Wendi needed work, and Margaret needed help maintaining her home. But Margaret's suspicious nature soon focused on her new employee, and those suspicions would prove deadly. Margaret became convinced that Wendi was stealing from her, taking money and items from her home during her cleaning visits. Whether these suspicions were based on fact or paranoia, Margaret decided that Wendi deserved punishment. But instead of firing her or calling police to report the alleged theft, Margaret chose a different path. She decided to become Wendi's judge, jury, and executioner. On February 8, 2005, Margaret lured Wendi to her home under the pretense of normal housekeeping work. But instead of cleaning supplies waiting for her, there were tools of torture. Margaret had planned what she would do to Wendi, had gathered the materials she would need, and had chosen a location where no one would hear the screams. What Margaret did to Wendi right over the next several hours represents some of the most sadistic cruelty documented in Florida criminal history. She didn't just kill her quickly in a fit of rage. Instead, she systematically tortured her, inflicting pain and suffering for hours before finally ending her life. The details of that torture are so disturbing that even hardened detectives struggle to discuss them. Margaret used various tools and methods to cause Wendi maximum pain and terror. She wanted her to suffer, to pay for what Margaret believed she had done. The torture went on and on, with Wendi begging for her life, pleading for mercy from someone who had none to give. But Margaret wasn't interested in pleas or apologies. She was interested in revenge. When Margaret finally decided that Wendi had suffered enough, she killed her and disposed of her body. Then she went about her business as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just spent hours torturing another human being to death in her own home. She didn't call police to report the alleged theft. She didn't tell anyone what she had done. She simply tried to return to her normal routine. But Wendi's disappearance didn't go unnoticed. When she failed to return home and missed other appointments, people began looking for her. The investigation eventually led police to Margaret, and what they discovered at her home provided evidence of the torture and murder that had taken place there. The physical evidence painted a picture of prolonged torture and suffering. Blood evidence, disturbed areas of the house, and other forensic findings all pointed to the horrific events that had occurred. When confronted with this evidence, Margaret eventually confessed to killing Wendi, though she tried to minimize the extent of the torture and claimed that the death had been quicker than it actually was. At trial, prosecutors presented the full scope of what Margaret had done to Wendi. They showed that this wasn't a quick killing in the heat of anger, but an extended torture session that had gone on for hours. The evidence demonstrated the calculated cruelty of someone who wanted to inflict maximum suffering on another human being. The jury heard testimony about Wendi's final hours, about the pain and terror she must have experienced, about how she had died slowly and agonizingly at the hands of someone who had hired her to clean house. They learned about Margaret's planning and preparation, about how she had turned her home into a torture chamber for her unsuspecting victim. On May 19, 2011, Margaret Allen was sentenced to death for the torture and murder of Wendi Wright. She was 69 years old when she received her death sentence, making her one of the older women ever to join death row. The judge found that the crime was especially heinous and cruel, warranting the most severe punishment available under law. Today, Margaret remains on Florida's death row, now in her 80s, and still fighting her conviction through appeals. Her case represents one of the most disturbing examples of what happens when suspicion and anger transform into sadistic cruelty. When someone decides that their perceived grievances justify torturing another human being to death. Christie Michelle Scott. Christie Michelle Scott appeared in Neighbors as an overwhelmed young mother trying her best. She had struggles, sure, but who doesn't when raising a child alone? What nobody saw was a rage building inside her small apartment in Russellville, Alabama. What nobody understood was that Mason had become an obstacle to the life she wanted, a burden she no longer wished to carry. The night Mason died, Christie told investigators he had fallen down the stairs. A terrible accident, she claimed, tears streaming as she described finding her son unconscious. But children don't get skull fractures from tumbling down carpeted steps. They don't develop the specific pattern of injuries that Mason displayed when paramedics rushed him to the hospital. Medical examiners found something Christie hadn't expected them to discover. Mason's injuries told a different story entirely. Someone had struck him repeatedly with tremendous force, crushing his small skull with blows that could only come from an adult's deliberate violence. The fractures radiated outward like a spider web, each crack representing another moment of impact, another second of a child crying out for the mother who was opposed to protect him. Christie had beaten Mason with a blunt object, police determined, though she never admitted what she used as a weapon. Maybe it was a hammer from her toolbox. Maybe a heavy pan from the kitchen. The specific instrument mattered less than the fact that she had chosen to use it. Chosen to strike her son until he stopped moving, until his 6-year-old body couldn't take any more damage. But the physical assault wasn't the only way Christie tried to end Mason's life that night. When beating him didn't kill him fast enough, when he somehow clung to life despite his massive head trauma, she made another choice that still haunts everyone who worked the case. She suffocated him, covering his nose and mouth until his damaged brain could no longer fight for oxygen. The investigation revealed Christie's mounting resentment toward Mason in the weeks before his murder. She had complained to friends about how difficult he was, how he interfered with her social life, how she couldn't do the things she wanted because of him. She spoke about him not as a beloved child, but as an inconvenience, a problem that needed solving. During questioning, Christie's story kept changing. First, Mason had fallen down the stairs. Then, maybe he had hit his head on something while playing. She couldn't remember exactly what happened, she claimed, because she had been in another room. But forensic evidence contradicted every version she offered, painting instead a clear picture of deliberate violence against a defenseless child. The trial revealed the full scope of Christie's crime. Prosecutors presented medical testimony about Mason's injuries, about how much pain he must have endured, about how long it would have taken him to die. They showed that this wasn't a momentary loss of control, but a sustained attack that went on until a 6-year-old boy was dead. Christie's defense attorneys argued that she suffered from mental illness, that postpartum depression and other psychological issues had impaired her judgment. They painted her as a victim herself, overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control. But the jury saw through these excuses to the truth underneath. Christie had murdered her own son because she didn't want to be his mother anymore. On June 6, 2013, Christie Michelle Scott was convicted of capital murder. 3 months later, she received a death sentence, becoming one of the youngest women ever sentenced to execution in Alabama. She was 26 years old when the judge ordered that she should die for what she did to Mason. Anita Carty. Linda had been telling people she was pregnant for months, her belly growing rounder as she crafted elaborate stories about due dates and doctor visits. Friends and family prepared for her new arrival, buying gifts and planning celebrations for the child she claimed to be carrying. But Linda's pregnancy existed only in her imagination and the padding she wore under her clothes. When the time came to produce the baby she had promised everyone, Linda realized she needed to find one somewhere else. 20-year-old Joanna Rodriguez had just given birth to a healthy baby boy named Ray. She was young, trying to figure out her life as a new mother, learning how to care for an infant while dealing with all the challenges that come with having a baby. She had no idea that Linda had been watching her, studying her routine, planning to take everything Joanna held most precious. On the night of May 16, 2001, Linda put her plan into action. She didn't work alone. 3 men helped her carry out what would become one of the most disturbing kidnapping cases in Texas history. They forced their way into Joanna's apartment, where they found a young mother with her 4-day-old baby. What happened next goes beyond ordinary crime into territory that most people can't comprehend. They bound Joanna with duct tape, covering her mouth so she couldn't scream for help. But they didn't stop there. They wrapped tape around her entire head, covered her nose as well as her mouth, making it impossible for her to breathe. While Joanna suffocated slowly, struggling against the tape that was killing her, Linda took baby Ray and prepared to present him to the world as her own child. Joanna died in her apartment, alone and terrified, fighting for air that would never come. She was 20 years old, and she died because Linda Carty wanted a baby badly enough to murder for one. Her son Ray, just 4 days old, was carried away by strangers who had killed his mother to possess him. Linda's plan might have worked if not for witnesses who saw suspicious activity at Joanna's apartment. When police arrived to investigate reports of disturbance, they found Joanna's body and began searching for her missing infant. The investigation quickly led them to Linda, who was trying to pass Ray off as her newborn son to friends and family. The evidence against Linda was overwhelming. Witnesses identified her as being near Joanna's apartment that night. Physical evidence linked her to the crime scene. Most damning of all, she was found with Ray, trying to claim him as her own child when everyone who knew her understood that she had never actually been pregnant. During the trial, prosecutors revealed the full scope of Linda's deception and crime. They showed how she had faked her pregnancy for months, how she had targeted Joanna specifically, how she had recruited accomplices to help her carry out the kidnapping and murder. The jury heard testimony about Joanna's final moments, about how she had died struggling for breath while her baby was stolen from her arms. Linda's defense team argued that she was mentally ill, that she genuinely believed she was pregnant, and acted out a psychological delusion rather than criminal intent. They painted her as a victim of her own broken mind, someone who needed treatment rather than punishment. But the jury saw past these explanations to the calculated nature of crime. The planning involved the cold-blooded execution of a young mother. On February 19, 2002, Anita Carty was convicted of capital murder for killing Joanna Rodriguez during the kidnapping of her infant son. The jury deliberated for just over an hour before recommending death, finding that her crime was especially heinous and cruel. She was 43 years old when she received her death sentence. Emilia Carr, February 15, 2009, was supposed to be a fresh start for Heather. She had been struggling, trying to get her life together, dealing with challenges that would be difficult for anyone her age. When Emilia offered her a place to stay, a chance to get back on her feet, it felt like the kind of blessing that comes just when you need it most. Heather had no way of knowing that Emilia's offer came with a price that no one should ever have to pay. Emilia Carr lived in Alachua County, Florida, where she presented herself as someone who cared about helping young people in trouble. She had a way of finding girls who were vulnerable, who needed somewhere to go, who were grateful enough for assistance that they wouldn't ask too many questions about the arrangement. What these young women didn't understand was that Emilia saw them not as people deserving help, but as opportunities to fulfill her own twisted desires. The details of what Emilia did to Heather over the following days represent some of the most disturbing abuse documented in Florida criminal history. She didn't just kill her quickly and move on. Instead, she kept her prisoner, subjecting her to prolonged torture that went on for days. Heather was bound, beaten, and sexually assaulted repeatedly, while Emilia and her boyfriend, Joshua Fulgham, took turns inflicting pain and humiliation. Heather begged for her life during those terrible days. She pleaded for mercy, promised she wouldn't tell anyone what had happened, offered to do whatever they wanted if they would just let her go. But Emilia wasn't interested in letting her leave. She was enjoying what she was doing to this 19-year-old girl, enjoying complete control she had over another human being, enjoying the fear and desperation in Heather's eyes. When Emilia finally decided that Heather had served her purpose, when the torture was no longer entertaining enough to continue, she strangled her to death with her own hands. Heather died slowly, feeling Emilia's fingers around her throat, looking into the eyes of someone who pretended to care about helping her. Her last moments were filled with the realization that she had trusted the wrong person, that her desire for help had led her into the hands of a predator. After killing Heather, Emilia and Joshua dismembered her body, cutting her into pieces to make disposal easier. They scattered the remains in different locations, trying to ensure that Heather would never be found, that her family would never know what had happened to her. But they couldn't destroy all the evidence of what they had done, couldn't erase the traces of DNA and physical evidence that would eventually lead investigators to them. When Heather disappeared, her family knew something was wrong. She wasn't the type to just vanish without telling anyone where she was going. They contacted police, started their own search, did everything they could to find her. The investigation eventually led detectives to Emilia and Joshua, and what they discovered at the property provided horrifying evidence of the torture and murder that had taken place. The trial revealed the full scope of the abuse Heather had suffered during her final days. Medical examiners testified about the injuries found on her remains, about the evidence of prolonged torture, about how she had died. The jury heard recordings and saw evidence that painted a picture of systematic cruelty that went on for days before her death. Emilia's defense attorneys tried to argue that Joshua had been the main perpetrator, that she had been coerced into participating in the crimes against her will. They painted her as another victim, someone who had been too frightened of her boyfriend to resist his demands. But the evidence showed that Emilia had been an active and willing participant, someone who had enjoyed what they were doing to Heather. On September 12, 2011, Emilia Carr was convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual battery. 2 months later, she was sentenced to death for her role in Heather's torture and murder. She was 32 years old when she received her death sentence, and she showed no remorse for what she had done to a teenager who had trusted her offer help. Emilia now sits on death row at the Lowell Correctional Institution in Ocala, Florida. Her appeals continue through the court system, but her conviction remains solid. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The jury's verdict decisive. The judge's sentence appropriate for someone who had tortured a young woman to death for her own entertainment. Kimberly Cargill. Some people kill strangers in moments of passion or desperation. Others murder family members in fits of rage or greed. But the most chilling killers are those who target the people trying to help them, who see assistance as betrayal and respond to care with violence. Kimberly Diane Cargill belonged to this last category, a woman so consumed with rage and paranoia that she murdered the social worker who was trying to protect her son from harm. Cherry Walker dedicated her career to protecting children from abuse and neglect. As a social worker in East Texas, she had seen the worst of what parents could do to their own children, but she never stopped believing that families could be helped, that intervention could make the difference between a child growing up safe or suffering in silence. When she was assigned to investigate reports of abuse involving Kimberly's son, Cherry approached the case with the same professionalism and compassion she brought to all her work. The investigation into Kimberly's treatment of her son had revealed disturbing patterns of abuse and neglect. The boy showed signs of physical and emotional trauma consistent with systematic mistreatment. Cherry documented her findings carefully, building a case that would protect the child from further harm. She knew that removing a child from their parent was always traumatic, but sometimes it was the only way to save them from worse trauma at home. Kimberly didn't see Cherry's intervention as an attempt to help her son. Instead, she viewed it as an attack on her rights as a parent, an invasion of her privacy, a threat to her control over her own child. The more Cherry pushed for protection measures, the more Kimberly's anger grew. She blamed Cherry for every consequence of her own actions, seeing the social worker as the source of her problems rather than someone trying to solve them. On June 18, 2010, Kimberly decided that Cherry Walker had to pay for interfering in her life. She didn't confront her professionally or file complaints through proper channels. She didn't try to work within the system to address her concerns. Instead, she chose violence as her solution, planning to eliminate the person who stood between her and continued access to her son. Kimberly lured Cherry to a remote area under the pretense of discussing the case. Cherry, dedicated to her work and believing that communication could resolve conflicts, agreed to meet with the angry parent. She had no way of knowing that Kimberly had brought a gun, that this wasn't going to be a conversation about child welfare, but an execution planned by someone who saw murder as a reasonable response to professional intervention. When Cherry arrived at the meeting location, Kimberly shot her multiple times, killing the social worker who had been trying to protect a child from abuse. Cherry died in a remote field, her body left where it wouldn't be found for days. Her death the result of trying to do her job with integrity and compassion. But Kimberly wasn't finished. After murdering Cherry, she went to even greater lengths to cover up her crime. She returned to Cherry's car and set it on fire, trying to destroy any evidence that might link her to the killing. She burned Cherry's vehicle completely, turning it into a charred shell that investigators would later find miles from the murder scene. The investigation into Cherry's disappearance quickly focused on Kimberly, whose hatred for the social worker was well documented through threatening phone calls and hostile encounters. When Cherry's burned car was discovered and her body was found days later, physical evidence and witness testimony pointed directly to Kimberly as the killer. During the trial, prosecutors presented evidence of Kimberly's escalating threats against Cherry, her planning of the murder, and her attempts to destroy evidence afterward. They showed that this wasn't a spontaneous act of violence, but a calculated assassination of a public servant who was doing her job. The jury heard testimony about Cherry's dedication to protecting children, about her professionalism in the face of Kimberly's hostility, about how she had died trying to help a child who needed protection. Kimberly's defense team argued that she had acted in extreme emotional disturbance, that the stress of the custody battle had pushed her beyond rational thought. They painted her as a mother driven to desperate measures by a system that was taking her child away. But the evidence showed premeditation, planning, and deliberate execution of someone whose only crime was trying to protect an abused child. On June 26, 2012, Kimberly Diane Cargill was convicted of capital murder for killing Cherry Walker. 1 month later, she was sentenced to death for her crime. She was 51 years old when she received her death sentence, becoming one of the few women on Texas death row for killing a social worker. Today, Kimberly sits in her cell at the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas, where she continues to fight her conviction through appeals. Her case stands as a reminder of the dangers faced by social workers who try to protect children from harm, and the extreme responses that some parents have to professional intervention in cases of abuse.